It was late afternoon when J.D. Vance, the influential Ohio politician, was walking down Main Street in a small town near his district. His schedule had been packed with meetings, speeches, and fundraisers, and the weight of the campaign hung heavy on his shoulders. Vance had been trying to keep his public image as polished as possible, especially during this heated election cycle. As he strolled past a few local shops, he was stopped by a man on the sidewalk, holding a cardboard sign that read, "Need $15 for food and a place to sleep." The man, disheveled but not particularly dirty, had an air of calm about him, almost as though he had done this before. Vance stopped in his tracks, staring at the sign. He had seen his fair share of homeless people in his travels around Ohio, but something about this interaction felt different. The man, middle-aged with a scruffy beard and tired eyes, looked up at him expectantly. "Excuse me, sir," the man said, his voice gravelly but clear. "Could you spare $15? I just need a meal and somewhere to sleep for the night." Vance's instinct was to move along, to ignore him as many politicians might, but something tugged at him. He had been campaigning on issues related to economic disparity, and here, right in front of him, was the embodiment of the very thing he had been talking about. He hesitated. No one expected what he would do next. J.D. Vance, standing on the sidewalk with the man's request hanging in the air, felt the eyes of passers-by on him. He could feel the weight of the moment. Politicians often faced moments like these, moments that could either help or hurt their image. His team had always advised him to stay on message, avoid distractions, and focus on the talking points that resonated with voters. This, however, was not part of the script. The man with the sign stood silently, waiting for a response. The cool spring breeze rustled the edges of his cardboard sign, and there was a quiet urgency in his eyes, something that seemed to speak directly to Vance's conscience. "I don't carry cash," Vance replied at first, his tone clipped, trying to deflect the situation. But as he turned to walk away, he paused. The man's eyes followed him with a mixture of resignation and hope, as though he had heard that excuse 1,000 times before. Vance took a deep breath. He had spent so much time debating policies and grand ideas, tax cuts, education reform, trade deals, but here was a simple, real human moment. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and withdrew a $20 bill. The man's eyes widened as Vance stepped back toward him. "Here," Vance said, pressing the bill into his hand. "Take this. Get yourself something to eat, and get off the streets for a while." The man looked at the bill, then back at Vance. For a moment, there was silence between them, like the weight of that $20 meant more than just money. It was a moment of recognition, of understanding. But then the man did something that no one, not even Vance, expected. "I don't need $20, the man said, his voice low but firm. "I need $15. I don't need charity. I need change." Vance blinked, taken aback by the response. It wasn't the gratitude he had expected. It wasn't the usual sigh of relief that most would show when given a handout. The man wasn't asking for more than what he had requested, he was asking for something different altogether. Something deeper. Vance stood there, unsure of what to say next. Vance stared at the man, his hand still outstretched, offering the $20 bill. The words hung in the air like an unanswered question. "I need change," the man had said, but Vance wasn't sure if he understood what that really meant. The homeless man didn't take the bill. Instead, he stood there, waiting, his weary eyes never leaving Vance's face. The tension between them was palpable. It was no longer about the money. It was about something far more profound. Vance thought back to his campaign speeches, to the way he had spoken about the economic struggles of the working class. He had often talked about bringing change, about fixing a broken system, about lifting people up from poverty and despair. But now, standing here, face to face with this man, the complexities of those ideas seemed almost too abstract. Vance's hand slowly lowered the $20 bill back into his pocket. For a moment, he considered walking away, but something within him stopped him. He looked the man in the eye, searching for understanding. "What do you mean by change?" Vance asked, his voice softer now, genuine curiosity replacing the political persona he had worn so well for years. The man shifted slightly, his shoulders slumping as he took a deep breath. "I'm not asking for your pity, sir," he said, his tone calmer now. "I've been through the system. I know how it works. You give me $20, and maybe I eat today. Maybe I get a bed for the night. But tomorrow, I'll be right back here. Maybe not on this street, but in another place, asking for the same thing. The system doesn't help. It just keeps you stuck." Vance felt a pang of discomfort, a small crack in the polished veneer of his political confidence. He had spent so much time railing against the establishment, but here, face to face with someone who had lived through it, his words suddenly seemed empty. "So what do you want, then?" Vance asked, his voice tinged with frustration. He wasn't sure what the right response was anymore. Was it just about the $15? Was it about a quick fix, or something deeper? The man smiled faintly, a tired, almost ironic smile. "I want people to stop looking at me like I'm invisible. I want a chance, not a handout. I want policies that don't just treat the symptoms but address the real problems, the housing, the jobs, the mental health care, the addiction. I want change that doesn't just make things look better for a few days, but changes the whole system." For a long moment, there was nothing but the quiet hum of the town around them. Vance's thoughts swirled. What he had thought was a simple, one-off interaction had turned into something far more complex than he was prepared for. This man wasn't asking for charity. He was demanding accountability, a shift in the way society viewed and treated its most vulnerable. Vance took a deep breath and finally nodded. "I hear you," he said quietly. The man's gaze softened, as if he understood that Vance, for all his flaws, was genuinely trying to connect. Then, without another word, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Vance stood there for a moment, the weight of the conversation pressing on him. The $20 bill, now tucked back into his wallet, felt heavy in his pocket, like a reminder of everything he still didn't fully understand. He continued his walk down the street, his mind racing with thoughts of policy and change, but this time, it was different. For the first time in a long while, J.D. Vance wasn't just thinking about what he could do for the people, he was thinking about what he had yet to truly understand. The next few days after the encounter with the homeless man were filled with a strange sense of discomfort for J.D. Vance. His staff had made it clear that the interaction had garnered some media attention, mostly from local news outlets, but also from a few political analysts who saw potential in it. At first, Vance thought little of it. He had given the man $20, after all, and had even had a moment of reflection about systemic change. It was a gesture, a brief conversation, and he had moved on. Or so he thought. The first hint of something larger came in the form of a tweet from a journalist. J.D. Vance promises change for the homeless. What did we really hear? Is this real reform or another campaign stunt? #change not charity #Ohio politics. Then came another tweet from a progressive organization. J.D. Vance says he'll address homelessness, but he gave a homeless man $20, not a solution. We need policy, not photo ops. #empty gestures. The backlash was swift. There were debates across social media about whether Vance's actions were genuine or just another attempt to appear compassionate during an election year. People scrutinized the interaction, parsing every word, every gesture, looking for signs of sincerity, or the lack thereof. The press conference that followed didn't help much. Vance was asked about the encounter during his next campaign stop, and his attempt to explain himself only seemed to deepen the divide. Look, Vance said, the issue of homelessness is complicated, and I understand that. But giving a homeless person $20 isn't the answer. We all know that. It's about changing the system, ensuring that people have access to healthcare, housing, and job opportunities. But you can't just throw money at the problem. The journalist, sensing an opportunity to stir the pot, pressed further. So, you're saying that your encounter with the man asking for $15 was just about sympathy and not about real policy change? Vance hesitated. What I'm saying is that we need long-term solutions, not band-aid fixes. I don't believe in just handing out money. I believe in policy that lifts people up. The response was met with mixed reactions. Supporters praised Vance for sticking to his principles, for framing the issue as one that required systemic change. But critics were quick to point out the contradictions. Vance gave that man $20, they argued. Why not use that moment to talk about actual solutions, not just empty promises? The tension was palpable. What had started as a quiet, personal moment had spiraled into something much larger. Vance's words about policy and change were now scrutinized and dissected with intense focus. But for Vance, the real weight of the encounter came not from the media storm, but from something more internal. He had spent his entire career as a political figure, speaking about change, about reform, and about the American dream. But when he faced that man on the street, all of those words had felt insufficient. He had offered money, sure, but it hadn't been the change the man was asking for. The man wasn't looking for charity. He wasn't looking for temporary relief. He was asking for a chance to change his life, to escape the cycle he was trapped in. And now, Vance found himself wondering, could he offer more than just words? Could he really bring about the change that people like that man so desperately needed? As the fallout from the interaction continued, Vance realized that his political career, the promises of reform, and the rhetoric of change all seemed so hollow in comparison to the real human stories unfolding outside the media spotlight. In the end, the question remained, was J.D. Vance capable of delivering the kind of change he had spoken about for so long? And more importantly, did he even know what it would look like? The days after the media storm had taken a toll on J.D. Vance. His campaign had become a focal point for criticism, with pundits and activists alike debating his sincerity and his commitment to addressing homelessness and poverty. He found himself giving speech after speech, trying to steer the conversation back to the policies he had worked on, tax reform, education, healthcare, but the narrative kept returning to that one moment on the street. It was late one night, after a particularly grueling interview, when Vance found himself in a diner just outside his hometown, nursing a cup of coffee. He had taken refuge here many times before, a place to think, away from the cameras and the constant barrage of questions. The din of the restaurant felt strangely comforting, the clink of dishes and the low murmur of conversation almost like a lullaby. As he sipped his coffee, his thoughts were interrupted by a voice. "You're J.D. Vance, right?" Vance looked up to see a young woman standing by his table, holding a notepad and a pen. She was clearly a journalist, probably from one of the local outlets. He'd seen her around the campaign trail, but had never really spoken to her. "That's me," he said with a weary smile, recognizing the telltale signs of someone about to ask him a pointed question. "I have to say," she began, sitting down without waiting for permission, "I wasn't expecting the public reaction to that homeless man. People are split on whether you're genuine or just trying to look good for the cameras." Vance sighed. "It's been a rough few days." The journalist raised an eyebrow. "Rough how? You gave a man $20. What's the problem with that?" Vance shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "The problem is, it wasn't enough. The money didn't change anything. It didn't address the root causes of homelessness, the system that keeps people trapped in poverty. The system is broken, and I'm just now starting to realize how deep that problem really runs." The young woman nodded thoughtfully. "That's an honest answer. But I'll ask you this, what are you actually going to do about it? Everyone's waiting for you to say the right thing, but no one's seen you take any concrete steps. If you want people to believe you, you've got to do more than talk." Vance felt a sharp sting at her words. She was right. His campaign had focused on the big issues, taxes, healthcare, crime, but homelessness had been one of those things he had talked about in passing, never really making it a priority. He'd used the same talking points, the same rhetoric about systemic change, but hadn't pushed for real, actionable policies. He'd been too busy with the politics of it all. "Maybe I've been too focused on the wrong things," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "I've been so caught up in winning, in being the candidate people want to see, that I've forgotten what real change looks like." The journalist looked at him, sensing the vulnerability in his words. "So what are you going to do now?" Vance leaned back in his chair, lost in thought. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't thinking about polls or donors or his next campaign event. He was thinking about that homeless man, about the words he had said, "I don't need charity, I need change." "I'm going to listen," Vance said, his voice firm now, a new resolve settling in. "I'm going to listen to people who have been living through the system, people who know what it's like to be left behind. I've spent too long talking at them. Now it's time for me to hear them. I don't know exactly what the answers are, but I'll be damned if I don't try to find them." The journalist gave him a small, knowing smile. "I think people might actually respect that." Vance felt something shift inside him. For the first time in his career, he felt like he was moving towards something more than just a political goal. He wasn't just campaigning anymore, he was embarking on a journey to understand the very issues he had spent years trying to solve. The next morning, Vance held a press conference where he made a bold announcement. He was assembling a task force to specifically address homelessness and affordable housing in Ohio, composed not of politicians, but of people who had lived the experience firsthand, homeless advocates, social workers, former homeless individuals, and experts in addiction and mental health care. He pledged to take concrete steps toward policy reforms that didn't just aim at managing homelessness, but at eradicating it. It was a risky move. His political opponents were already lining up to criticize him for changing the subject so abruptly. But for Vance, it was no longer about the campaign. It was about doing something real. As the press conference ended, Vance walked outside into the brisk morning air, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, filled with resistance and setbacks, but for the first time, he felt like he was truly moving toward change, not just for the voters, but for people like the man on the street, the ones who had been invisible for too long. He couldn't promise everything would be fixed. But he could promise he was going to try. And for the first time in his political career, that felt like enough. The next few months were both challenging and revealing for J.D. Vance. The task force he had set up, filled with former homeless individuals, activists, and experts, quickly became a focal point of his campaign. It wasn't an easy task. There were countless meetings, hours of discussion, and many uncomfortable moments. Vance had to confront his own biases, his own preconceptions about homelessness, about what it meant to truly help those in need. But as the work began, something remarkable happened. Vance started to change. He wasn't just hearing the stories, he was living them, even if only vicariously. He visited shelters, talked to individuals who had once been on the streets, and spent time in the communities that had been forgotten by the very policies he had once championed. Every conversation left him unsettled in a way he hadn't anticipated. One cold evening, Vance found himself in a small, worn-out shelter in Cleveland, sitting with a man named Michael, who had spent years moving in and out of homelessness. The shelter was bare bones, flickering lights, creaky floors, and the constant sound of coughing and murmurs. The smell of dampness and disinfectant lingered in the air. Michael had lived on the streets for over a decade, long before Vance had ever considered the issue of homelessness a personal one. Now, as Vance sat across from him, he felt the weight of his earlier missteps. This wasn't about providing a warm meal or handing out a few dollars, it was about understanding how people ended up in this position, and how society failed them. "I used to work," Michael said, his voice gravelly. "I had a job. But the system wasn't built for people like me. I got sick, lost my job, and when I couldn't pay my rent, they kicked me out. Then, it was a never-ending cycle, no place to go, no resources. Eventually, I just gave up. They said I was lazy, but it wasn't that. It was that the system didn't care." Vance sat there, his mind racing. He had heard similar stories from others, but hearing it firsthand from someone like Michael was different. The anger, the frustration, the exhaustion, it all came through in a way that no policy paper or campaign speech ever could. "That's not right," Vance said quietly. It was a simple statement, but for him, it felt profound. For years, he had talked about welfare reform, about the importance of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, but now, sitting across from someone who had lost everything, the words felt empty. Michael nodded, his eyes tired but sharp. "The system doesn't make room for people to fall down and get back up. It just keeps you down." Vance's resolve grew stronger. It wasn't just about reforming housing or providing temporary shelters. It was about dismantling the barriers that kept people like Michael from having a chance at a fresh start. He knew the task ahead was enormous, but now, he was no longer in it for the headlines. He was in it for the people. Back in Washington, the reactions were mixed. Vance's shift in focus from traditional Republican talking points to a more hands-on, human-centric approach to homelessness garnered both praise and criticism. Some of his colleagues admired his commitment, while others saw it as a political gamble, a deviation from the tough-on-crime, tax-cutting agenda that had been the cornerstone of his career. The media, too, was divided. Some reporters framed his efforts as a bold step toward real reform, while others accused him of opportunism, pointing out that this wasn't the typical J.D. Vance they had come to expect. The change in his approach was palpable, and it was evident to everyone watching that he was no longer the same person who had first entered the political spotlight. One night, after a particularly difficult meeting with his campaign team, Vance found himself alone in his office. The pressure of it all was mounting, the media, the voters, his own sense of self-doubt. He stared out the window, wondering if he had made a mistake. But then, he remembered Michael's words. "The system doesn't make room for people to fall down and get back up." Vance's thoughts swirled, and he knew deep down that this was his chance to truly make a difference, not just in the eyes of voters, but in the lives of those who had been ignored for too long. He stood up and walked over to his desk, grabbing a pen and jotting down some thoughts. He knew it wasn't going to be easy. There would be setbacks, critics, and moments when it felt like progress was too slow. But he was determined to see it through. The road ahead might be rocky, but for the first time, he was headed in the right direction. As he signed off on a new piece of legislation, one that called for increased funding for mental health services, expanded housing assistance, and comprehensive job training for homeless individuals, Vance realized something important. This wasn't just about winning an election anymore. It was about doing something real. Something that mattered. And for the first time in his career, J.D. Vance was willing to take the risk. The road less traveled was never easy, but it was the only one that could lead to true change. And Vance was determined to walk it, no matter the cost. Months passed, and J.D. Vance's commitment to tackling homelessness became more than just a campaign talking point. It became a battle. A battle against not only the entrenched political systems but also against the cynical forces within his own party that saw his efforts as a threat to the traditional conservative agenda. The task force he had formed continued its work, but progress was slower than he had hoped. Bureaucratic red tape, resistance from local governments, and a general lack of funding made every step forward feel like 2 steps back. But Vance, despite the setbacks, refused to back down. He had heard too many stories like Michael's to turn away now. At the same time, the media attention didn't wane. The pundits kept coming at him from all angles. Some accused him of being a hypocrite. How could he claim to care about the homeless when his party's policies had often exacerbated the problem? Others saw it as a misguided effort, a liberal cause disguised in conservative clothing. But Vance wasn't listening to the critics as much anymore. He had found a new motivation, the people he had met, the faces that had become real to him in a way that politics had never allowed before. One morning, while preparing for a rally in Dayton, Vance received a call from his campaign manager. The news was grim. A rival candidate in the upcoming election had begun running ads attacking Vance's new focus on homelessness. The ads played into the narrative that Vance had abandoned his roots, his focus on traditional issues like national security, the economy, and crime. The message was clear: Vance is out of touch, and he's pandering to the left. Vance didn't know what to think. He had expected resistance, but not so soon, not from his own side. His campaign team wanted him to focus on the safe issues: tax reform, economic growth, and border security, anything that didn't make him look weak on the issues that mattered most to conservative voters. But Vance couldn't do that anymore. He knew that if he returned to the old ways of thinking, he would lose everything he had gained: the authenticity, the genuine desire for real change. So, after a long pause, he made a decision that would solidify his path. The next morning, at a rally filled with hopeful supporters, Vance took the stage. The cameras were rolling, and his campaign staff anxiously awaited his every word. He began with his usual rhetoric, talking about the need for stronger borders, for a booming economy, and for jobs that would bring prosperity to every Ohioan. But then, he paused. There was a silence that hung in the air, and for the first time in months, Vance stepped away from the script he had written 1,000 times. He looked out at the crowd, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "Folks," he began, "I've been campaigning on all the issues we care about: taxes, healthcare, jobs, crime. But I've also realized something. Something that's harder to talk about but just as important. The people we've been leaving behind, the ones who sleep in the streets, who can't get the help they need, who fall through the cracks, we've ignored them for too long. And it's time for that to change." He paused again, allowing the words to sink in. The crowd was silent. Some were nodding, others exchanging glances, unsure of where this was going. Vance continued. "I've met with people, real people, who have lived through the worst this system has to offer. I've seen firsthand how we've failed them. And I won't stand by and pretend that I can fix everything with a simple solution. But I can promise you this: I'm going to keep fighting for real, long-term change. We're going to make this system work for everyone, not just the ones at the top." His words hit harder than he anticipated. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some supporters applauded, while others remained uncertain, skeptical about his shift in focus. But Vance knew this was the only path forward, one that was not about winning over every single voter but about standing firm in what he believed was right. After the rally, the media coverage was predictably divided. Some outlets praised him for his courage in addressing a sensitive issue, while others ridiculed him for what they deemed a political gamble. His opponent ramped up the attacks, questioning Vance's credibility and his ability to prioritize the needs of Ohio's working-class families. But amid the noise, Vance kept his focus on the task at hand. He worked alongside his task force, pushing through legislation that would provide more funding for affordable housing, mental health programs, and addiction recovery. He also championed initiatives aimed at creating job training programs for homeless individuals, offering them the tools they needed to rebuild their lives. As he navigated the difficult waters of both politics and real-life change, Vance realized that the journey was much longer and harder than he had expected. But for the first time, he didn't feel alone in the struggle. The people he had met, the ones who had given him their stories and their trust, kept him grounded. They were the reason he couldn't give up. And though he faced intense criticism and pressure to abandon his focus on homelessness, Vance was determined. He knew that real change wasn't just about passing laws, it was about shifting hearts and minds, changing the way people saw those who had been marginalized, and giving them the dignity and the opportunity they deserved. The road was long. The political cost was high. But J.D. Vance was no longer just a politician running for office. He was a man on a mission to change the very system that had kept so many people down for far too long. As the election drew near, J.D. Vance found himself standing at a crossroads. His commitment to homelessness and systemic change had cost him more than he had expected. Polls showed a dip in his approval ratings among certain segments of his base, voters who were more concerned with traditional conservative issues than with his new, more compassionate approach. His opponent, seizing the opportunity, attacked him relentlessly, branding him as out of touch, accusing him of pandering to the left and abandoning his conservative principles. But Vance knew, deep down, that the path he had chosen was the right one. It was messy, it was uncomfortable, and it often felt like an uphill battle, but he had come too far to turn back now. The faces of the people he had met, the homeless individuals, the social workers, the advocates, were constantly in his mind. They had shared their pain with him, and in return, he had promised to fight for change, not just for political gain but for something far more important, a chance to rebuild lives. As the election night approached, Vance's campaign staff prepared for the worst. They knew that his bold stance had cost him votes, especially among the more hardline conservatives. But Vance wasn't concerned with the immediate outcome anymore. This wasn't about winning a race, it was about leaving a lasting impact on the people of Ohio and the country at large. The results came in that night, and as expected, the race was tight. The media, once again divided, focused on the high drama of the election, the dramatic shifts in the political landscape. Vance's opponent pulled ahead early, but as the night wore on, Vance's numbers slowly climbed. By the time the final results were tallied, Vance had won. It was a narrow victory, but it was enough. And when the news broke, the celebrations were tempered with a sense of exhaustion. His victory speech was less triumphant than most, more subdued, but it carried a weight that none of his previous speeches had. Standing at the podium, Vance looked out at the crowd, supporters who had stuck with him through thick and thin, despite the doubts, despite the risks. He took a deep breath, then spoke with a quiet, determined voice. "Tonight, we've won," he said. "But this isn't just my victory, it's a victory for everyone who's been overlooked, ignored, and left behind. It's a victory for the homeless people we too often pass by, for the people who have lost hope, for the families struggling to make ends meet. Tonight, we begin the hard work of changing the system, of giving everyone a chance to rebuild their lives." The crowd erupted in applause, but Vance could hear the whispers of doubt lingering, especially from those who had never quite bought into his message of reform. Would he really follow through? Would he stay true to his commitment to change? Vance knew the answer. He wasn't done. The victory was just the beginning. In the years that followed, Vance's focus on homelessness and systemic reform became the cornerstone of his political career. It wasn't always easy. There were setbacks. There were battles with his own party, fights for funding, and endless debates about how to approach the issue. But slowly, piece by piece, policies started to change. Affordable housing programs expanded. More funding went toward mental health and addiction recovery. Employment initiatives for homeless individuals gained traction. And while it was far from perfect, Vance could look back on his time in office and see real progress, change that wouldn't have happened if he had continued on the same path as before. His legacy, though still evolving, was becoming clear. He had not only changed the way people saw homelessness, but he had changed the way politics could be done. He had taken risks, stepped out of the safe lanes, and chosen to fight for something bigger than any political gain. One evening, years after that pivotal moment on the street with the homeless man, Vance found himself back in the diner in Cleveland. He had visited it many times since, often alone, reflecting on his journey. As he sipped his coffee, the familiar weight of the world on his shoulders, the door opened, and an older man walked in. He looked familiar, his face weathered by time and hardship. It was Michael, the same man who had asked for $15 all those years ago. Michael spotted Vance immediately, and a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. He walked over, a little slower than before, but still with that same quiet dignity. "Good to see you, Senator," Michael said, his voice softer now. Vance stood up, surprised to see him, but pleased. "Michael," he said with a warm handshake. "It's been a while." Michael nodded, sitting down across from him. "Yeah, it has. I've been doing okay. Got a job. Got my own place now." Vance's heart lifted. He had heard about small successes like this, but hearing it firsthand, from the man who had started it all, was a moment of true validation. "I'm glad to hear it," Vance said, his voice full of gratitude. "I never stopped thinking about that conversation we had." Michael smiled again, a rare thing. You didn't have to fix everything, JD. You just had to make sure people like me had a chance. And you did. Thank you. Vance looked down at the table, feeling a weight lift from him. For the first time in years, the battle didn't seem so hard. The work wasn't over, and he knew that. But seeing this moment, this change, made everything worth it. He raised his coffee cup, his voice steady but sincere. To change. And to the people who remind us why we have to keep fighting for it. Michael nodded, clinking his cup against Vance's. The road had been long, and the journey was far from finished. But J.D. Vance knew one thing for sure, the real work of change was never easy, but it was always worth it. And as he looked across the table at Michael, he understood that the change they had fought for was already happening, one person at a time.